Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. In this podcast, we're going to be diving into the ancient myth of Atlantis, but uncovering more than a myth. We're going to go into what likely was a reality of an advanced civilization that we are rediscovering right now and finding lots of really compelling evidence to support that it not only existed, but had so much high technology and advancement in knowledge, understanding, spirituality, the cosmos, and beyond. We're going to look into all those amazing mysteries today with some really fascinating research coming from a good friend of mine. And I hope that we don't get cut off because we tried to record this earlier and we got into this, just an intro right where we are now, and things got shut off. So we'll see how long we can go today on this brave new world of the internet. But I'm really excited to be joined today by Neil Nobriga, who's coming to us from the US today. And I'm going to let Neil do an introduction for herself because Neil's got such an interesting mixture of not only background, but also of research. I'm going to let Neil tell you a bit about himself today. But Neil, how are you doing today? Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It glitched out there for a minute. I thought I was going to lose you again.
Well, this is the thing. I'm getting internet is unstable, even though it's at full bars. And for our lovely watching and listening audience, we're recording this on October the 16th, 2023, and the internet has become an interesting place where it is more challenging to just have free open conversation. So who knows if this is why it's getting shut down, but who knows,
Sure.
who cares? Let's just have our conversation the best way we can today, and we'll see how it
Oh,
goes.
well, thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Um,
So could you tell the audience, yeah, just a little bit about maybe your background? How did you get into this? As always, like this niche of the ancient mysteries is something that always has a good, background story. So it'd be great to tell the audience, where are you coming from with all this research today?
yeah, when I was younger, my grandfather, on my dad's side, we discussed a few minutes ago, brought home kind of the catalog of Greek myths. And I began there, really, is where my journey began, is understanding a lot of those myths and how they applied to modern life and things like that. I'm from a military family. I myself am a three-tour combat veteran, formerly of the 82nd Airborne Division. Um, my entire family is pretty much a government service family. That's what we do. um, and just before I left to the military, a good friend of mine handed me a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and it really kind of kicked off um, more of a. And he also handed me Fingerprints of the Gods, but I did Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings first. By Charles Hapgood and respectively Graham Hancock, who did Fingerprints of the Gods. And those books really kind of took me over as far as what was out there beyond just what you learn in school and what you do in college. And I had done my first trip in college, a research project on Atlantis, and it just kind of fell short at the Bimini Road because at that time, you're talking 1999, a lot of the knowledge that we had today just wasn't available. And if it was always considered conspiratorial or, anything like that. So I've been kind of on this journey for quite a while. And then it really kicked off when I got this current contract that I'm on. Unfortunately, because of my non-disclosure agreement, I'm not allowed to discuss it or the name of it even. So, but a lot of the stuff that I've come up with that I kind of discovered stemmed from being here and seeing the things in real time, especially when it came to the cosmology and the astronomy and astrology that we understand today. We can now link back to a culture that was living in California and thriving in California well prior to the Ice Age, the end of the Ice Age. So that's kind of where it begins. And then, we'll go over this crater analysis today. Crater analysis in military terms is a way to determine the azimuth, or basically the direction of an enemy weapon system that's fired at you. And you can use the crater left by the munition to backtrack an azimuth to find out where it came from, and then you use roughly the max range of the weapon system to determine where it is on that azimuth. And I've done that today with a crater impact on the Earth, and it really much aligns with Plato's narrative of what happened to Atlantis. And as we discussed in one of our previous conversations, the only reference I use when it comes to Atlantis is Plato's description. Now, everybody else has great ideas, great theories. There's nothing wrong with any of them. But as far as, as factual as it can get, I just rely on Plato.
And for our audience too, Plato, if you're not as familiar, is really the folklore or the written, testimonial of the existence of Atlantis that we really do have to go on. And as we know, Plato got this from his grandfather, I believe, Solon, who went to Egypt and got all the information from the ancient Egyptians, because, certainly something that has at least come up a lot in these theories and these conversations is that Egypt was likely a sort of last deposit, perhaps, of some of the Atlantean knowledge. You have these places like the Library of Alexandria and all this knowledge of the old world that they definitely reference many, many times. So, I would say that with Plato's written account of Atlantis, it is a pretty solid amount of evidence that we do have to certainly start with, because he got a lot of this from the ancient Egyptians, who I would certainly trust with having a solid a knowledge of where that comes from. So it's an interesting source, definitely, because like you said, everything else, you can talk about things like Edgar Cayce, but that's still a channeled, Akashic record reading perhaps of these things, which again actually has a lot of credibility in a maybe more spiritual sense, because a lot of people have come and found the physical evidence to support these channelings or these readings. But you're right, with Plato, it's like that's a written, tangible piece of evidence. It's the best that we have, at least as far as we know right now.
Yeah. And, as far as it goes, we know Plato embellished it. Obviously, he was trying to make a play to the modern Greek society of his time. His story kind of ends middle of a sentence, and that's kind of an analogy to what happened to Atlantis, as they were just in their day to day, and then suddenly they weren't. So even Francis Bacon's New Atlantis ends the same way. It ends in the middle of a sentence, and that's kind of the analogy. Is when it comes down to it, whether you believe it's an act of God or an alien race wiping us out, it could happen that fast. So.
There's so many ways. I mean, you mentioned Fingerprints of the God, Graham Hancock. I was lucky enough to see Graham lecture when he was in Toronto many years ago. And he talked about, how we pass through an asteroid field twice a year, that even just that alone, the likelihood of getting some fragments of that asteroid field hitting and colliding with this Earth is a solid, there's a good chance. Yeah. And it's not to be fear-mongering at all, because I'm not about that on this channel, but it's definitely about the idea that these things are an absolute reality. And it's more of a question of when do they happen, right? And we do know, and we're going to get into this analysis soon, of these impacts that have absolutely happened on our planet, and maybe as early or as recent as 12,500 years ago to end perhaps the last ice age, right? And Atlantis, as far as we know.
Yeah. I believe this crater, it's largely ignored because the evidence kind of speaks for itself, and it really does stomp on a lot of toes. And I would estimate 10,500 BC is likely when this happened. This was likely Noah's flood. I don't necessarily buy into the narrative that it happened in 6,000 BC. I'm more of the opinion that people get their dates wrong, especially when the media, and I'm not talking about modern media, I'm talking about the media of ancient times, was basically carve it into a stone, paint it on a rock, or, until the Egyptians, brought in papyrus and things like that. Oral traditions and stuff, I think a lot of the dates tend to get blurred, and, it's not that they're wrong, it's just that you find evidence that maybe supports a better narrative, and I think that's where we're at now.
Yeah, and I think the 10,500 BC or 12,500 years ago date, I mean, I see that coming up all the time, everywhere. Sometimes from channeled readings from people, and sometimes from just physical evidence to support, again, the end of the Younger Dryas and the massive cataclysmic end of the last ice age. All, the geology supports 12,500 years ago. The ice core samples from Greenland support 12,500. So we can start to see the correlation. So that's where it makes these myths a lot easier to start finding reality in.
Sure. And even Graham Hancock placed in his book that a lot of the temples that we find are sort of oriented to that star date. And so we tend to ignore it in the West, but we're finding more and more evidence around the world that the pre-existing cultures to the modern Western civilization knew what happened. They recorded it as best they could, but again, you get dates mixed up, and you're talking about, 12,000 years of population recovery after a massive cataclysm. Things are going to get a little construed, so.
And it's a great point, Neil. Maybe we should touch on that just before we get into your analysis. We got to, to the audience, listening and watching this, we got to understand is that we're almost like a recovered civilization today. We've recovered from a massive traumatic, huge apocalyptic cataclysm that definitely happened. It seems to be around that 12,500 years ago. We have this epigenetic DNA in our bodies that likely remembers this trauma or has some inkling of a memory there. And you can just see how, like, for thousands of years, we've been essentially rebuilding. And it's been up and down, and it's been up and down. But would you agree, or would you say roughly like we're still we aren't where we are today for the first time? This is a reset. We are now back to maybe where we have had some advancement from our Atlantean distant past, but seems to be a cycle, does it not?
So yeah, when you look at Plato's narrative and when he says they lost up to 65 million people, I mean, obviously they knew there was at least that many people on the planet. So that tells you somebody had been around the world before at that time. That's one of the biggest clues that a lot of people kind of miss when they're reading these narratives is how did they come across a census like that? Because only the Greeks were doing it, the Egyptians maybe, but there's no way that you knew how many people China had or North America had or Central America had. So when you estimate 65 million people wiped out in a day, that's probably just locally. That was just probably in their general areas. So you really can't tell how many people were wiped out. So if you really think about how long it takes human procreation, a 9-month cycle, and that's only if things go well, and you're only going to get maybe, let's say 10 kids per human. And if, you go by our, life expectancy versus ancient cultures, which was 30, maybe 40 years. And again, assuming, there weren't complications at birth and all those other things, it would take about probably 4, 5, 6,000 years to regenerate a population worthy enough to come back to where we are. And that hits right about the time of this cataclysm in 10,500 BC, we'll say, to about 6,000 BC when the Fertile Crescent cultures pop up. So that's about the math kind of evens it out.
Yeah, it's a really good point because where we're taught in history, and this is the funny thing, right? When we're taught in history, well, civilization started in Mesopotamia, ancient Sumeria, and this is where we got writing, this is where we got astronomy, this is where we got all of these amazing languages and sciences. And it's like, first of all, how did it just happen out of nowhere?
Right.
Because that's another, like, scratching your head. Like, I thought evolution was a thing that was incremental. How did it just spread out of nowhere?
Magically showed up 6,000 years ago, and here we are.
Well, exactly, and that's literally what we're taking for granted in our history classes when we're taught this. And so then the other question, of course, is then, if it just spread it out of nowhere, was it then maybe this, yeah, exactly, like a reset where, oh, okay, we've had to survive for the last 6,000 years? Because it seems to be as well, what was happening was a major cataclysm followed by a series of smaller ones.
Yes.
And a very turmoil surface of our planet. I mean, challenging living situations, I would say. And makes sense as to why we see a lot of evidence of people going underground for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. And again, just like you're just in survival mode. So you couldn't possibly be advanced. Yet 6,000 years ago, that's maybe when we had that ability to finally start rebuilding, perhaps.
Yeah.
Civilization.
And because when, one of the big clues from the California indigenous people was that after this because they believe a cataclysm occurred, their dates don't line up with anybody else's, but they're still on par with that narrative. I think it's only like 60 or 65 people survived. So yeah, when the entire population of California is wiped out, to only 65 people from these 3 particular indigenous groups, and that's marked by the site I work. It shows you that would take a long time to recover a population, to have the maturity of culture to bring about writing, math, astronomy, astrology, folklore, all that stuff. It would take a while.
It would. And then, you do get the other questions of, was there help? Did we get any help along the way?
Yeah.
And that's a whole other
and I do agree with a lot of the theories where some of the Atlantean survivors, because when you have to look at Atlantis's military capability, they likely had trade routes globally, and they likely had military outposts to defend those. And those were the people that managed to become leaders in the post antediluvian world. I agree with that 100% because coming from a military background, that's exactly what we do today. And if there was a cataclysm, there would likely be some pretty solid American leadership from the military bases globally. It just kind of makes sense.
I know, and I love that. I actually quite enjoy going into a lot of military research, because the military is fascinating to me. Because one of the things that you can kind of rely on the military for is if it works, they're going to do it. So for example, I like looking into the military for research into the supernatural and the psychic abilities because they do. Remote viewing is one, right? And they put a lot of money into that. So if there was no results and there wasn't anything to it, they wouldn't invest that kind of money. So I like to look to the military sometimes as well for sometimes their research kind of transcends sometimes the academic world because your motivations and maybe storylines, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the sort of the dogma that we experience a lot of the time in academia, right? Where how many times have we seen through history, like Galileo as an example, right? He presents something that we now know today as fact. It gets completely denounced by everybody because
around what?
Exactly.
Yeah,
We see this that's human nature. We're just like also this is
right.
how we kind of seem to be. But regardless, like I like to look at the military because they kind of can bypass sometimes a lot of dogma and just go, does it work? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Is there validity? Yes or no? And that's a cool approach that you've taken. And so maybe to segue that, I think I didn't know this about you, Neil, that you had the background from the military to examine impacts, because of course that makes sense to me now that you're saying it. A missile impacts, you can glean so much information from the way that would impact. Why would it be any different with an asteroid, for example?
Yeah. And like I said in the crater analysis that I presented, you can do all this from Google Earth. You don't need my crater analysis. I mean, it's really easy to do without it. I just bring some graphics to kind of point out, where it goes. And I don't know if you can show it, live while you're doing this, but we can start there. Like I said, crater analysis. I was a 13 Foxtrot, which is a forward artillery observer. And one of the first things they teach you how to do is a crater analysis. So when you're being fired at, you can figure out where the enemy weapon systems are coming from. And we used it a lot in Afghanistan because we were getting rocketed, quite a bit. So I kind of took that knowledge that I had, and when I really started investigating this a little further, because I knew there had to be something that people were missing, and it's literally right in front of your face. You can do it from Google Earth any day of the week, and you just kind of follow the path. And what I tell people to do is kind of start on the coast of North Africa, and actually start out of northeast China. Again, I don't know if you can bring up the slides or not, but you'll start to see a heat taper that begins out of northeast China and follows over the Gobi Desert into Iran and Afghanistan. You can see the dredging of these mountains that are just being wiped off as this asteroid basically is breaking the atmosphere at this point. It's likely spinning like a rifle round, and it's made of mostly ice with like an iron core. So as it's come through our atmosphere, it's now starting to fragment, and a large chunks of this ice particles breaking off and slamming into the ground as it starts approaching, and then it ends up flying over North Africa, out of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, into Libya, that area, and then pounding the Atlantic Ocean right off the Cape Verde Islands.
So as you're going through this, Neil, and I'm gonna finally pull up the slides here. It just took me a moment to find them here. So watching and listening audience, we're going to go into a more visual part now of the presentation. So if you're listening, you can always check this out on YouTube or Rumble, more likely than anything these days. But we'll also describe it to you, as Neil has been doing a good job of just describing that this impact in general, to give you a sense, right, of what are we looking at. And as we pull this up here, you're going to see exactly what we're talking about, which is this was a huge, massive impact. So Neil, Let me know. I'm on your first slide here. Let me know if.
So the first slide is mostly just to pinpoint people where this projectile began breaking into the atmosphere. I do have a backblast tsunami slide that shows some of the contours around the North Russia, Northeast Russia, and China, likely caused by backblast tsunami. As this thing started breaking in. And it starts to widen over. You can see Iran, Afghanistan area, general area. You can see the Himalayas are kind of there. You can see the Gobi Desert, the big notch out there. Likely, because you notice you have this giant flat Gobi Desert and all this rather mountainous range. I'm not saying that this asteroid created the Gobi Desert, but it certainly reshaped it. And the ice would have done that. It would have impacted and then melted, and there would have been no evidence whatsoever that anything ever happened because it was just a large chunk of ice that managed to, and superheated ice because now it's hot going through the atmosphere and breaking apart. So it would have likely put a lot of water, and then you can see just the dredging off the mountain into basically modern day Iran.
And that's
That's
a really cool thought as well. It's like reminding myself and of course our audience here that this asteroid, it's not just rock, right? This thing is a bunch of ice. And then not only ice, but it's now become supercharged hot water almost.
Yeah, fire and water in one.
It's like ice water, so it's like a heavy impact, but it's also adding a ton of more water to the surface of the planet, as well as just a massive tsunami or series of tsunamis. So.
And then when we get to the actual Atlantic impact, and you see where that wave went, you can see that those vibrations, Newton's third law of energy, object in motion wants to stay in motion. Once that water got set and pushed like it did, the back tsunamis and the backwash, the constant ebb and flow of those waves would have taken years probably to calm down enough, and it would have likely, kept making just dramatic floods and.
And this is the thing too, is that like we were saying before, people this lasted for hundreds, if not thousands of years after this initial impact. So that's another thing we got to remember, is that this was such a challenging planet to be literally living and surviving just as a human. Forget advancing in any way. It's like we're just surviving.
Yeah. So when you take the narrative of Plato and that's the only one you stick to, you can see that this is literally what happened. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You go to slide 2 for me. You see the red line is the likely path of the actual asteroid. The yellow lines, again, are just kind of tapering to show where it was headed. And then you see the pink circles are basically where giant fragments of this asteroid were falling off and smacking the ground. Again, you can see the dredging, the actual mountains themselves are liquefying and moving because we're talking about superheated ice, which as a weapon system would be pretty, ingenious because there's going to be not a lot of evidence of it later. And then I'm of the belief that North Africa and Saudi Arabia were likely shallow seas. And then when this impacted on slide 3, you can see it hits about the Cape Verde Islands. You can see the crush around the middle of the Atlantic. You can see that any water that would have been on North Africa was likely pulled off. And then the purple circle is, it was originally one of the, before the Ricat structure was really discovered and known, it was kind of the catalyst for the island of Poseidonis, the last standing capital of Atlantis. But I believe that the Ricat structure was actually that, because when you look at when you zoom in later to North Africa, you'll see that it was literally right underneath that asteroid impact. So it likely pulled all that water off. So you go to slide 4. And you can see the impact a little bit better from Cape Verde. You can see the crust of the Earth is now malformed, right? You can see there was a landmass that was in the Atlantic Ocean that was likely taken out.
It looks like the spine of it almost, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And they're trying to say that plate tectonics did this, but this is not plate tectonics. Look at the smoothness of the inside of the crater versus the external areas, outside on that ridge. That is not plate tectonics. That is an impact crater, as every bit as it can be. It's just underwater.
You're bringing up such a good point. I just want to harp on this for a second for our audience. So Neil's talking about fast geological changes that absolutely can happen. And I think another thing that we're typically taught about geology is everything's very slow. These changes and erosions happen over thousands or millions of years and this and that, which is true. These things absolutely happen. And we also get massive, huge shifts in our geology from impacts, from cataclysms, and from very fast things. And that's when I was in Egypt with Dr. Robert Schock, who's the geologist, he reminded us of that, where he's like, it's not all slow. Geology can actually happen really quickly you've got huge bodies of other geology smashing into each other.
Right. Yeah. And here we have evidence of it in plain view that most people just don't realize that that's what you're looking at.
Yeah.
And, you know, we could go to slide 4, or where are we at? We're on 4 right now. So yeah, we have that. So we'll go to slide 5. And now what we're looking at is we see off North Africa, the impact, you can see the crater, and turning the world kind of on its side gives you a better view of what ended up happening with this massive tsunami wave. So when this asteroid actually impacted the Atlantic Ocean, it likely at impact put a wave that could have been anywhere between 3 and 7 miles high at impact. So you're talking about a tsunami of epic proportions. And you can see that not only did it impact, but likely had a piece that skipped right across the Atlantic Ocean. Now that the water's moving, it would have, especially when you get to Central America and Mexico and Cuba and Haiti and all these areas, you can see the trench that this asteroid just buried itself and flung off and created. And then I have a circle here. You see the two little ones and then the pink one to the right. That's actually your Bermuda Triangle. That's likely a piece where a piece of the metal that was in this asteroid was magnetized and buried in the ocean. And that's why you can see the triangulation of the circles. It's not as intense as the Bermuda Triangle, but likely because of time, the intensity of the magnetism that's disrupted in that area has lessened. But I guarantee you, at point of impact, this was likely a very magnetized, irradiated zone. And then you go to slide 6, and now you can see the first.
Quick question before we go to slide 6.
Sure.
We just did an episode on the Bermuda Triangle a couple weeks ago, which we haven't launched yet. But anyway, that'll be up by the time people are watching this. And you know, one of the theories I heard about the Bermuda Triangle was it was also a remnants of some Atlantean crystal tech that was having electromagnetic phenomenon. But what you're saying is that also, or instead of that, could have been this like metallic chunk of this asteroid that got lodged into the area that we now know as the Bermuda Triangle, and that could be potentially what's causing all the disruptions, because it seems there's definitely an electromagnetic situation going on in that Bermuda Triangle. Why, we don't know, but that could be
it can definitely be both. I would not disagree with it, because if you look at where the Rakat structure lies, and if things were blown off the North African continent with the force of this tsunami, there could very well be a piece of technology that ended up there and sunken underneath the ocean. It's not impossible. I just kind of gravitate towards more magnetized metal causing these kind of compass variations that you find. I just kind of go with the physical evidence that we have. Clearly, there's been decades of reports of just electromagnetic interference. And the thing that can do that the easiest is a large chunk of ionized metal that just creates its own magnetic field and disrupts what we have. Plus, the Earth being a magnetic conduit itself with a magnetic field, it could have supercharged in the atmosphere, or, you know, if this was a piece of Atlantean tech, I mean, it could have been thrown into the air, into the stratosphere, as far as we know. Who knows? You know, there's so much energy in this impact.
Because it's another good point, Neil, because look at the chaos that's happening on this on our beautiful planet. I mean, think about it, in this day and age, all of our tech, you know, like our nuclear power plants and stuff, they would get blasted all around the world, and you'd end up having radiation in places that never had nuclear power, as an example, right? So this is a good point, good way to kind of a fresher or more open mind way to look at what was the real reality of this cataclysm 12,500 years ago, and then the literal ripple effect and not literal ripple effect of this.
And slide 6 will really tie this in, because it actually shows where the initial waves went, and you can see the contours of our own Earth versus this impact. That wave was massive, and that's why we do not find any evidence of any of these cultures, short of the few things we have discussed from my site. There was nothing left. It literally wiped out basically the Western Hemisphere, you know. And those that did survive, and when you look at Native American lifestyles after, you know, their origin stories after this cataclysm, their lifestyles are complete survival, where they don't waste any of the animal. They give blessings and everything to every bit they have, and that comes from a humility and a humbleness from probably surviving an act of God type cataclysm like this, you know.
Just imagine, like, you're like it's hard to imagine, but try to imagine, our wonderful audience watching and listening to this, like try to imagine if that were to happen today, and not to get too dwelled in the horrible aspects of what that would feel like today, but think about this, like you everything that we take for granted is gone completely.
Right.
You are now hunter gatherer, survival mode, and like your only connection now are the people that are physically standing right in front of you. They might be your family and friends if you're lucky, or they're total strangers that you've just had to connect with to survive. And that's literally it. You're just you're back into full on survival mode, having left a probably advanced civilization. I mean, what a shock to the system.
Yeah.
And I mean, just the older world, right?
Yeah. So you go to slide 7, and again, when you turn the Earth on its side, you get a better feel for what happened here. You can see that wave, and these are just generic graphics, but you can see what happened. You can see that wave literally wiped out. And then the secondary that's kind of off to the left, a little small, there's probably secondary wave. After, you're talking about, you just displaced the entire Atlantic Ocean. You pushed it over the continent that blocked it from the Pacific. It's got to come back. And what it basically did was it kind of created the Amazon and the Mississippi River, and that's why everything in those rivers is brackish, shallow water. There's nothing left, and you might find some evidence in some of these. You look at the coastline, you can see there's probably a couple hundred miles of shelf that's now inundated. That would be where you would probably find any evidence, short of the pyramids in central Mexico that survived, because I don't believe those were built in 1200 BC. I think that's ridiculously naive. But yeah, you can see that the topography of the Americas was literally just completely rewritten. And then you go to slide 9, and you can see back. This is the same triangle that was in slide 5. But now we're kind of looking at it from more of a traditional view. You can see the gouging through Cuba and Haiti. You can see that anything that would have been in central Mexico all the way to the Rocky Mountains was just gone, and the Andes as well in South America. And that's why you just don't find any evidence of these cultures, because they were just literally obliterated.
Unless, and the only way we do is the people that I think also slightly may have anticipated this, and maybe potentially put some of these teachings like into stone. We were talking earlier about, some of the writings that we do find about our history. A lot of them had to be written in stone. Well, was it written in stone purely because of more primitive culture, or was it written in stone because we knew that was one of the best ways to actually preserve? Like, think about now, everything we have is digital. The grid goes down, everything's lost forever, gone. So,
and even with our best paper, and even with our best paper and pen, that if you don't preserve those papers, you're not going to have them in 100 years. They're gone. So, putting things into stone, cave art, those kind of things you're talking. And so we discussed it earlier that it puts the Bering Strait migration into a whole new context, because I do not believe the Bering Strait migration was primitive people looking for new hunting grounds. These were very advanced people traveling a known trade route to get back home, because they were forced off the continent from this cataclysm.
Such a different perspective, but it makes sense to me. I'm like, that makes sense. Wow.
Because if you think about it, if you're, I guarantee you're on the North American continent, and you might be in California and everything else. Sorry, I just got interrupted with a phone call. You might be in California or Oregon or Washington, or maybe up into Canada and Alaska, and this wave hits, you're going to be affected by it. You're going to feel it. You're going to have, severe. Basically, what you have is you have superheated ocean water that hits these, glaciers, and it rapidly melts them. And then the Earth, because of the rapid melting, cooled the ocean water down enough that the Earth's, temperatures could kind of sustain itself and generally fix itself. Because if this asteroid had hit the North American continent or hit North Africa with a direct shot, we wouldn't be here. Guarantee it. We, at least not in the condition that we're in now. We would never have, what we have today. It would have been a whole different scenario had anyone even survived.
Wow. Humbling.
Very
humbling. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So just the size of this impact crater, Neil, is just it's like we kind of think about it. And part of you, when we hear Graham Hancock or Randall Carlson or anyone talk about these impact theories of the end of the Younger Dryas, 12,500 years ago, the end of Atlantis, all this stuff, it always sounds massive and intense, but then just to see the scope on this Google Earth.
That's why when I go to slide 9, if you go to slide 9, it backs out and it just traces where the water was, and that's how big that tsunami was.
Wow. Wow.
Massive.
Massive.
And that doesn't even count the south and north poles, and even the counter tsunami that came back from the Pacific.
Right. From the melting ice caps, the end of the last ice age.
Yep. And then the constant, weather. So
it's absolutely crazy. Okay, I have a question. It's a little off topic here, but I'm just curious if your background and with your research, if you have any knowledge of this, and I'll just stop our screen share for just a moment. We can come back to this anytime. With these cultures that were escaping a massive cataclysm, I've heard some folklore from the Hopi specifically that talk about going underground and actually having their people saved by other peoples that lived in the inner or underground. I'm curious if you've got any of your folklore, or just any stories that you feel comfortable sharing, if at all, about any survival stories. Like, what did we do? Do you have any stories of how we even got through this?
Yeah, so there's two from the North America. So I got to iterate that I'm also Cherokee, and I have a Cherokee advisor that's been sort of teaching me on a lot of the mother culture and more ancient mysteries of the Cherokee. I can't really divulge a lot of it. I like to keep it secret. But when it comes to the survival, there's two stories and several. Generally speaking, they came from either caves, mountains underneath the ground, and then they kind of rose up. Like when you talk about the Navajo, they have a story where they came out on corn stalks, and as the waters receded, the corn stalks grew, and that's how they managed to survive. And then you have like the Valley Yokuts and the Mountain Yokuts in California, that they knew their ancestors were tying canoes to the tops of the trees in the mountains because they saw this coming. So that's how they survived. And then you have the Ohlone, Miwok, and Bay Yokuts that they talk about Brushy Peak and Livermore being kind of the place where their 65 people survived, and that's where they came from. And so when you follow all these Native American traditions, and each indigenous nation has its own story, but the stories are so similar that you can't say it's not a coincidence and that they were talking and this is all some sort of conspiracy. This is just what they know. Their ancestors survived a great cataclysm, and they did it in different ways. They either went underground or they went and tied themselves to the tops of trees on the tops of the highest mountains in California to survive this incoming wave.
What a trip. Because you know what? I mean, that makes sense. I've thought about that. I live here in Vancouver. We're right on the coast of the Pacific here, and but we got some big mountains. So I've always thought, like, we got a big tsunami coming here, I'm going straight up that mountain.
Yeah, high ground.
It's the most logical survival move in that situation.
And these people were not dumb. These were not, cavemen. No. These were not, simple people. These were quite advanced culturally people, and they saw this coming. They knew how to at least mitigate some of that and managed to survive, because if they hadn't, like I said, we wouldn't be here.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. So thank you to our ancestors for keeping us going here. Wow. Yeah. Very humbling story, and again, like, there's just this perspective. Like, people will sometimes ask me, like, what's the point of even going into these ancient mysteries, right? And like alternative history theories and things. And I'm like, well, first of all, if you don't know where you come from, you don't really know where you're going as a species and as a culture. And also too, like, just this shift of perspective to know that we have come from a very traumatic and intense cataclysm, that we were once an advanced people, probably multiple times over. I think personally, we these things seem to happen in cycles. But regardless of that, it's like, it's a humbling experience, because we also know that right now we can tap into that ancient knowledge and bring more of that back. And why that is important, at least in my opinion, is because there was so much that we understood in the past about, one, how to live on this planet harmoniously, how to use the earth in a much, much more efficient and harmonious way to create free energy, to create, all forms of sustainability that we would love to have today. But also ways of viewing the cosmos, ways of viewing spirituality, connecting with one another. There's just so many amazing things we can take from our past and integrate into today. I was actually curious, and this goes outside of Atlantis and the impact theory, but what have you learned from your research, as just as an example, some basic things like meditation, yoga, qigong, tai chi, the idea of like moving life force energy. These are ancient practices that you
Sure.
can look back thousands and thousands of years. They're very helpful in today's day and age. Have you come across some things in your research that you kind of think when you come across, like, man, we could use that today?
Yeah, actually, I was a student of Aikido for about a decade, and that's nothing but energy transfer. It has nothing to do with striking or anything. It's just basically your opponent is putting energy into you, and you redirect that energy. And that is a very simplistic form for a more advanced type abilities that I think we have. Aikido comes from Japanese Budo or sword fighting. It's basically unarmed sword fighting, and the Japanese, and you mentioned several cultures of yourself, they all have this principle of the ability to redirect bodily energies, and at least focus them in ways that are, beneficial to the spirit and the soul. And again, each person will have their own unique sort of ability with that. And I found that with my travels, because as a drummer and a musician, as you know, we can hit harmonies and weird chords and patterns and pulses. Like me being a drummer, the average person loves playing in 4/4 time. I don't. I love playing in the most obscure odd times because for me it just tickles my brain in a way that
I can
keeps me
appreciate that. Yeah.
yeah, it keeps me motivated. Yeah, the stuff I'll send you, it's all pretty. I'm trying to release a couple albums, and I'm not plugging that here, but you'll see it's more it's more spiritual for me than it is, trying to sell an album or something. For me, it's a very humbling and spiritual vibration that I am able to sort of transcribe. It comes through me from somewhere. I don't know where it comes from, and I just have the ability to put it out that in a way that people enjoy. And so that's where everybody, like I said, everyone's got their own unique vibe, and
Yeah.
that's kind of mine. So
And you know what, I'm all about plugging it you here, Neil, because I think people need to hear this type of music where it is coming from a different place. It's not just your top 40 pop stuff, which is fine too. Nothing wrong with
yeah,
that. However, we're bringing, myself with my musical background. A lot of my influence came from all this research from our distant, mysterious, and amazing past, because I learned
oh
about
for sure.
frequencies like 432 hertz and how to tune your instruments to that very harmonious frequency that can be found all throughout nature and throughout a lot of ancient sites like the Great Pyramid. And so that's influenced my music. So it's all connected. And for the audience watching and listening, I will have some links to what Neil wants to share with me and how you guys can connect with him and listen to his music. That will be in the show notes. So check that out, as well as my stuff as well, because music is amazing transmission. It's a universal language, and it was in all cultures all through time, permeating history, permeating
Yeah,
culture, connecting everybody universally. So music's I think one of the
yeah,
most amazing things we have from our distant past that we still take to today, because there's also such functionality with music and sound that I know the ancients and certainly a lot of our indigenous cultures to this day still keep that knowledge of the power of sound. Like sound is everything, vibration is everything. And that's
yeah.
another ancient concept that we could learn a lot from.
Yeah. Same with dance. Not to discredit
Yes.
modern pop dancing, but ritualistic dance from indigenous populations, they were literally conveying messages through motion, and that's why most of their ancient stories have survived because they didn't have paper and pen, they didn't have a computer and typewriter. They had their bodies, and so they could sing and they could dance, and that's how they passed a lot of the traditional medias on. And then you get into things like the Hopi and Navajo sand painting. That's more of a more of a religious type thing for them because at the end of the day, after the sand painting was complete, it had to be destroyed before dark. So it was just kind of like they could write it, they could do their design, they could do their message, but then it had to be erased because I do believe that they held on to the belief that if they maintained records in permanent media in some nations, it would likely regenerate the cataclysm that they had already experienced. And so that's where you
Wow.
get that kind of idea that we
Hmm.
can't keep the media, that we can dance, we can sing, we give it to the earth, we give it to the spirit, and then it's gone, and then we do something else.
Neil,
So
you bring up something so interesting. I've heard some of these kind of counter arguments to why in history, and it's certainly in like what is recognized as mainstream history, why is it that the written word and the written record is really the only one that we ever take as valid? And then oral histories are always very much kind of written off, so to speak, and discarded. When you really think about it, an oral history actually might have a higher chance of preserving the true story than the written one, because the written one can be rewritten by one individual with a ton of power that can then back people throughout history. An oral history has to kind of have a consensus. When you try to keep that oral history and that story going, if someone else who knows that story and they know that you're manipulating it or changing it, they're like, whoa, from my grandpa told me this, and actually it was more like that. And there's almost more of a way to maintain. I mean, you still have the broken telephone effect, but I would argue that you have a better chance at maintaining the core of that story than you might actually in a written history as a counter argument to that.
Certainly in a post-cataclysmic small culture recovery, when you only have a couple dozen people and all they can do is sing and dance because they're happy to be alive, that's likely the reason we have the information we have today, because eventually it got translated into, okay, they're dancing, they're singing, they're using their voice, they're using your bodies. What does that mean? And then somebody at some point in time started writing it into the stone and painting it on, glyphs and things like that.
Wow.
I feel the telephone game, obviously you have to take that into effect in any culture, anything. And you do get a lot of that between the indigenous populations, where my grandfather said this, his grandfather said this, and they're not quite matching up. But if you search deep enough and you listen hard enough, and that's really what it boils down to, you find continuity within the stories, especially with the anthropomorphic deities. And then when that relates back into the constellations and the astrology and astronomy, you start finding that the global cultures all had the exact same story, and they're just little minor interpretations that are different, maybe character flaws or whatever. But again, I can't delve into too much of how I came to this conclusion because of the site, but when you really start listening, and I think that's the problem in America, is we don't listen to the stories. We get the generic version, and then we kind of just tune it out to go do whatever we're going to go do. But when you really sit down and listen to the elders of nations, they tend to all be telling the same story from the same point of view, from the same experiences of their ancestors. And again, they want purity of the story. They have no reason to manipulate or tell a lie. It doesn't do anything for them to do that. So I agree that the oral traditions are a lot more accurate than we would ever give them credit for. And the reason the written of modern day academia is not as trustworthy anymore, because it has been bought off. It is all about money and control. And until we can break that kind of cycle of, okay, well, you might be the professor of whatever, but these people experienced what you're trying to say they didn't experience. I would rather trust their story than you.
Yeah. First-hand accounts versus sort of egotistical superiority complexes that come with academia. Nothing against my wonderful academic friends out there who are doing amazing work. I mean, it's a complex situation we have here on planet Earth. Lots of nuance, and I know with a lot of my friends who are scientists, who are academics, they come up against the challenges of pushing ideas forward in academia. Takes forever, usually takes generations to get these things fully accepted. And that's a long time, especially nowadays. I think we need to be adopting these new views a little bit quicker, or at least being open to them a little faster, so that we can evolve faster as well.
For those who forget their past, condemned to repeat it. So
exactly. That's why we're all about talking about it here on the channel. Neil, I would love to also get your thoughts on like what, and feel free to, if there's more we want to talk about here on the impact, let me know. I still got the slides ready, so let me know. But I would love to get your interpretation of Atlantis. Like, what was Atlantis before this cataclysm? You mentioned before a likely capital for Atlantis. So are we talking global civilization? Like, what are we talking with Atlantis?
Well, when you look at Plato's narrative, he describes it as the first civilization to domesticate the horse. And this is a clue that that ties us back into the Americas, because the horse was not native to Europe or Africa or Russia or anywhere. It was actually native to South and North America. So where did those horses come from? And you're talking 12,000 years ago and further. So we can even take it back 100,000 years, even 200,000 years, because the Indian records, and I mean East Indian, tell us that the Great Mother has shaken many civilizations off her back. And those are Manly P. Hall quotes. And his series, I have links in the reference page I sent you to all his podcast or his lectures and stuff. That's where I draw a lot of heavy influence, because his understanding, he was a 33-degree Mason. He was very clearly in the know about things that the average person is not allowed to know. And a lot of those secret societies can tie themselves fraternally back to Egypt. And you get into sort of that Masonry versus Illuminati type stuff. The college fraternal system has been both productive and destructive in the same way, because productive in that some of these lesser known facts are still alive and around today, and then destructive because the money has corrupted it to the point of, academia says this is the way it is and that's the way it has to be. So when you look at Plato's narrative by itself, the horses are a big thing, and then the location west of the Pillars of Hercules, and somewhere they just assumed in the Atlantic Ocean. So when you go to slide, you can actually skip from 9 to 11. We go to this interesting structure called the Rakat structure that was found in Mauritania in North Africa. And you can see the comparison of Atlantis's three-ring atoll. So you have this comparison on the right, as you look at it, is the actual Rakat structure that's in Mauritania, North Africa. And the left is Plato's description of that, of what it would look like if it just based on his description, nothing else. There's no mythology there. It's just how Plato described it. How, as you mentioned earlier, Solon was inducted under the temples of Sais in Egypt, about what was there and what it looked like. And so when you have that, and then you go to this, where you have the artist's interpretation of Lake Titicaca and the type of civilization that they were doing, you can see it's almost exact. It's the exact same type of idea, where you have these atolls, moat structures, and things that prevent land armies from actually being able to nab your capital. And again, Atlantis is credited with modern warfare. Warfare as we know it today, as the Greeks and Romans knew it, was invented in Atlantis. So they clearly had the defensive capabilities and ideas that no land army will ever be able to get into our cities, because we have these atolls that are basically surrounded by moats. So we go back to the Rakat structure, and then we look at it where it happened in North Africa. And this is the slide that you actually have. So I'll go back to me, and you can put it up for your people to see. Basically, this is the blue outline is kind of the same yellow pinpoint area of that asteroid, and you can see the dredging of the water that was in North Africa and how it got pushed into the Atlantic Ocean. And then you can see this big burn spot right here, that something massive hit there, and where the Rakat structure is actually located, how close to the coast it actually is, and how far away. So if there was, and I do believe this was the city of Poseidonis in a shallow sea that was here. It was wiped out by this cataclysm. And when you think about an orbital strike, let's say it was an advanced civilization from space trying to wipe out the most advanced civilization on Earth, their accuracy is 97%. I mean, it did what it was supposed to do and then some. So that should be.
I really can't help but think that, I got to say, I think I was more, before our podcast, from all my research in my life, I was really feeling like this cataclysm was more not natural per se, but more in the natural, like cyclical, universal element of like, okay, planets just have these cataclysms, I'm sure, and they would reset civilization. But knowing Atlantis the way that I've also learned about it too, definitely a warring civilization. It seems that we have inherited a lot of that tradition, and being a warring civilization, that means they're fighting other people. And those other people
Yeah,
are going to have.
allegedly, this happened because of their attempted conquest of Europe. They were attempting to gain influence in Europe for whatever reason, and this happened. So that explains why there are pockets of these advanced people showing up into these Fertile Crescent civilizations several thousand years later because they just happened to survive and happened to be able to find their way back into these culture groups. But when you think about, the previous slide where Lake Titicaca and the Rakat structure, they're all built the same way. That implies that these two cultures were cross-communicating, cross-developing, obviously had a trade route and probably a trade language. And you can, sort of break that apart symbolically with Native American indigenous symbolism and Egyptian symbolism. And then you go into the technologies, and we think of technology of like laser beams and satellites and all this kind of stuff. But when you really think about it, even the simplest of technologies can bind cultures together. And the one technology that I really bring a point to is both Egyptian and Native American basket weaving, because basket weaving, especially when they utilize the exact same plant, the exact same way, and the way they processed it, the way they weaved it, the way they decorated it, you find very, very many similarities between Egyptian and at least North American indigenous basket weaving. You have those very.
Yeah, just to jump in here for a second, Neil. We also have, when I was in Egypt, they were my Egyptologist guide was telling us about how they've found remnants of cocaine in some of the mummies, meaning the coca plant that comes from South America, native to South America. Yeah. How did it get to Egypt if there was no trade? I also went to another pyramid further south down the Nile. Forgetting it was, I think, the Temple of Dendera, and outside of that, there's a bunch of hieroglyphs and just full on like scenes that have been, obviously drawn on the side. And one of the animals that they depict is a bird, I believe, that's completely native to Australia. Another example again. So we've got like very physical evidence as well to support more of what you're talking about here. Like absolutely, they very much were seafaring people, trade. This idea of water landlocking people and stopping trade is actually such a funny counterintuitive idea. If anything, the water and the oceans and all that connected the world to be able to trade more in the distant past.
Exactly. And the star knowledge is, generally how they navigate it. So you could tell an anthropomorphic story of a star deity. And then, if you have cross-cultural references or trade languages, those translate into directions. And I kind of touch on that in the book that I can't publish. The kind of information you can glean from star watching, you can encode language, you can do all kinds of things with it. And it's likely that these people did. So if we can think about it today and kind of backtrace how it works through the monument process, we can see that they definitely had trade language. They definitely had cross communication and global navigation. Even though it might not have been commonplace where everyone had it, there were enough of them that did have it. And I think, when you think about the conquest and the Spanish move with Columbus to try to prove the world was round or whatever, I think a lot of the context behind that was less about proving the world was round and more about proving that there was gold and wealth in a nation that was likely not popularized, because the knowledge of Noah's flood, because I do agree that this cataclysm was likely the catalyst for Noah's flood. They knew the West was there. It wasn't like they didn't know, because they went fully prepared, and just Columbus had the balls to stand up and say, okay, I'm going to do it. And granted, I don't like the idea of Columbus Day, because I don't think he discovered anything, Basically, what I always tell people is when it comes to Columbus Day, he discovered the ignorance of Spain, because they clearly had the precipice that something was there, because they launched a full-scale invasion almost immediately after, once it got back that he was able to get there safely. And a lot of that comes, you talked about land bridges and connections, and the Seminole Indians in Florida, they basically have a tale that there was a land bridge that likely connected North Africa to South America in the Haiti Cuban area. And you can almost see with that crater analysis that there was likely, even with that island that's kind of off to the top of the north, there was definitely easier way to get across the Atlantic Ocean than we've ever been allowed to believe, because we want to believe that everything we're taught in school is correct. But,
as we're discovering, not the case.
yeah,
And
not the case.
there's so many things, Neil. I mean, I would so many things. Like,
It's going to be a 3-part series by the time we're done. But.
it really has to be. I mean, like, look, we're talking about Atlantis, right? This is a whole civilization that existed, before the end of the last ice age, that likely had really fascinating technology, stories, myths, whole history that we're still just rediscovering now. One of the things that you were talking about, though, and I think this is really important that we start to at least kind of think about this as a concept of what the old world may have been like, which is, we had advanced peoples of, like, let's say, an Atlantinian civilization. And as you said, there was also turmoil on the planet with Atlantis. And as I've heard in other stories, cultures that might have been known as maybe Lemuria or Mu or other different types of people that also existed on Earth that had different, philosophies and ways of living than Atlantis. And sometimes they came, into collision with one another. But then outside of these two major civilizations, there were also smaller ones of maybe more actual just human-based hunter-gatherers. Just like we have today in our more quote-unquote advanced civilization, we still have certain cut-off island or tribal peoples that have completely kept themselves separate from society and are still hunter-gatherer. So we have this variety of different ways of living, even in our modern age. It may have been very similar in the distant past. You have different levels of advancement for different people in different areas.
And that in of itself explains why, and again, I would think the early fraternity systems of universities and cloister schools and stuff, that the wealthy landowners were the ones that had all this knowledge, and I guess you'd say the peasantry were just kept in the dark. And so eventually it got to a point where they needed to either prove it or shut up. So they decided to launch this invasion. And when you put Atlantis in the context that they were likely a very powerful Black culture group, that in of itself sort of rewrites everything we know, because if it really pisses off Western civilization to know that Black people are probably exactly the reason we have the culture stuff we have. And I guarantee you, North American indigenous people, as far as astronomy, astrology, masonry, and a few other sciences that are attributed to Western civilization, did not come from Western civilization. They were likely put into place by these cultures that were here, and they were people of color, period. End of story.
End of story. Look at ancient Egypt. I mean, I get a lot of comments from folks from Africa on my episodes that we do about ancient Egypt, because again, it's like, just look at the statues. I mean, just the physical features are obviously from the continent of Africa. It's like, it's so clear.
And Graham Hancock touches on that with the Olmec statues in South America and Central America. They're very, very African in their features, and
actually, the Olmec, if anything, are an example too of multiculturalism, because you don't only get just African, you also get Asian features as well, and like Polynesian as well. And it's just like, we've always.
Next episode, we'll probably discuss more of the Ife and the Ashanti and all these other very powerful African cultures, because they tie directly in. Their knowledge base is very much Atlantean when you just break the story down, and the fact that they're still in the area, that should pretty much tell you that that's who it was. I mean, it doesn't take a
I think we're gonna need a couple more episodes, Neil. Yeah. I think today this is a perfect kind of spot maybe to end our conversation for today. Before we do eventually end it, and I'll get you to give your contact information if you feel like divulging in any way. But before we do that, just your final thoughts maybe on Atlantis, but also just this journey we're on as a species, uncovering this past. Like, I talked about why it's important to me, but I'd love to hear from you. Like, why is all of this important? Why are you as obsessed, clearly, as I am about this fun, fascinating part of our history? Like, why is it important to you?
It's instinctive in me. It's something I was born into. It's just something that from the time I was a very small child, that vibration of what happened, just the curiosity. So Manly P. Hall breaks it down where you can present a fact and it's either accepted or it's not accepted. Or you can tell a story, and it brings the intrigue of where did that come from? How did it happen? It starts causing you to think more. And I think that that was Plato's ultimate goal with the Atlantis narrative, was to say, this is what I was told. This is how I interpret it. And it's important because, he describes the physical evidence that he got. It came to Solon under the Temple of Sais. One of Solon's nephews became a follower of Plato. And then that's where the story was given to him. And then he sort of, you're talking about one of the smartest people in the world at the time. Why would he all of a sudden tell a fictional tale that, that wasn't his ball game? He was all about decisive, poignant living fact. And so he got this story, and we know he embellished it. There's some details in there that are like, oh, okay, maybe that's a little strange, but for the general idea that it's a legitimate place. And it came, again, like you said, from Egypt under the temples of Sais. And here we have this sort of fraternal underground secret society that's passing along information because it knows it can't maintain it through whatever political, geopolitical events are occurring in their time. Solon was a statesman. He was all about removing the mortgage stones from Greece so that there was no debt, so people could own their land and all that good kind of stuff. So the fact that he got the story and then he immediately began to say, I'm not a storyteller. I can't put this where it needs to be. But Plato was like, oh, I got it. I'll do this. That curiosity that came from this mega advanced civilization, it just draws the spirit to it. And it says, you can investigate this. You're not going to find a lot of evidence, but what evidence is there, as long as you can present it in a way that's, positive and not stepping on every bit of academia's toes, you can sort of kind of make your own version of it. And that's really kind of what I enjoy doing, is just, I've experienced things that the average person has never experienced and probably never will experience. You're aware of where I work and what I do. And for me, a lot of it, because I had a lot of this knowledge base and training and studying before I even got here. And then I got here and it just solidified everything. So it made things a lot easier to process. And then you're able to, like I did with this creator analysis, backtrack and start showing what happened. So we have a narrative, we have a story, and now we have evidence to support that story. And that's where I'm at.
I love it, Neil. It's you bring up something too that I think is really good to reiterate, which is story. We are a species that thrives and almost exists because of story. You could really break it down. I mean, we're storytelling people. So when people say, oh, well, that's just a myth, that's just a legend, I always have to go, yeah, but how else could we preserve it then?
Right.
Like, if we don't preserve that story, then it's literally gone, because you're right. No one really sits down and just wants to memorize some facts and some data. It's just
not conducive to how we think. It's not how we operate. Like you said, our brains are wired for the intrigue, for the story, for the ability to process things beyond accepting a fact or not accepting it. The story just makes our brains want to chase it.
It's his story. It's a story. Even in the news, today's top story, it's like, it's a story. We are always telling stories. And
the news just came out and said, this is a fact. You'd be like, oh, whatever, dude. Like, I don't care.
I know. And then they have to literally market it in that way. It's a story. Mm-hmm. And that's why myths and that's why legends, I think all of them have at least a fragment of some form of a truth, if not maybe quite a bit of truth to look into, and then do what you're doing, which is hopping on things like Google Earth or going to physical locations as well. And that's what I love to do as well. And just see if it connects.
I love myths because I love either proving them or debunking them. And there's several that I can prove, but I can't write it down because of the NDA. But,
right.
It's been a journey for sure. And my experiences have been nothing but positive, and I want to just share it for the people that want to listen.
And I think for me as well, personally, this journey of discovery, this journey of the knowledge seeking that we're on is such a, it's a spiritual endeavor in of itself. It's a very life affirming and fun. It's fun. It's exciting. It really gives me a lot of purpose and drive and just it just fills my soul. It really does. And it's the process in of itself is really most of the fun anyway. It's like any good, why do we love the genre of mystery? You know, why do we love science fiction and, you know, fantasy? It's the same kind of playing on that same curiosity and zest for the magic of life, because we know what we're given as the mainstream version of what reality is. It's just not doing it. It's just not quite
and so, you know, you make your own reality, and you can make it whatever you want. And that's the beauty of it. And like I said, I never knock anybody's Atlantis theories and stuff, because they're not wrong. You know, they might be absent of evidence, but that doesn't mean they're wrong, because like you said earlier, we have a vibration and a connection to that past. And some of us believe that you are Atlantean. You are the re-embodiment of that same spirit that was wiped out in that cataclysm. I know that I've had plenty of dreams in my life, all through my life, about floods and inundation and deluges and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So for me, it hits that spiritual vibe. I just know that there was more than we're being told.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what drives us here on this channel, Ancient Mysteries on Earth. So with that in mind, Neil, where can people find you? Where can people connect with you best?
Email is generally the best way to do it. northmountainpsc@gmail.com. That was my old business email, but I still run it just because it's easy there. My Hotmail account I tend to just use for transferring music. So I'll send you some samples of stuff and see what you think about it. Hopefully you'll enjoy it, because it's on that vibe. It's just my creative outlet is how I put that energy into something. You know, I've had, you know, not only some very good blessings in my life, but I've had some traumas too, like anybody else. And so I like to take that negative and turn it into something positive that people can enjoy. So
that's a transmutation at its finest, you know?
Yes, sir.
I love it. And so that'll be in the show notes. Exactly. That'll be in the show notes for the wonderful audience watching and listening right now. You can check out Neil's email down there if you want to connect with him. And as far as anything else goes, you wonderful audience watching and listening, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. If we want to learn more about the channel and what we're doing here, that's all going to be in the show notes below. So feel free to check that out. And when you're watching this, if it is still in that time frame before the fall of 2024, make sure you check out the description, because we got some links to our Egypt trip that we are doing in 2024, the fall. It's going to be pretty magical, very much in alignment with everything we've been talking about today in this episode, and really trying to get really back to one of our foundational civilizations that we all originated from. So it's exciting.
Try to get to the city of Sais and see if you can get underground. Tell me if that's there.
Well, we're going to definitely have to do an episode or two before I even get on that trip, Neil, because there's a lot of Egyptian, not prerequisites, but things I do want to build up in terms of what we can be.
Yeah, Egypt in of itself is a checklist that I'll get to eventually. But I mean, like, there's so much good research out there from good quality people that short of just visiting it, being there for the experience, you know, you can get good quality information. So.
Correct. I think most of the reason we're going to be going physically is not to actually necessarily uncover new research, which sometimes happens, which is really exciting when that does happen. But it is to experience what I'm sure, Neil, you experience a lot where you work, which is these physical sites have an energy, they have a phenomenon about them, and they're all unique and they're all different. And when you go to them physically, you will experience things, a whole variety of things. And I won't try to put too many ideas into your mind, because it's going to be pretty individualistic what you experience. But these places are magical, they're sacred, they're special for a reason. And our consciousness gets to interact with them in very fascinating ways. So I'm excited.
They're designed to tickle your brain in ways that we can't even fathom anymore.
Yeah, you know? I love that. Tickle your brain. Exactly. Exactly. So
thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Neil. I'll keep you on after I stop recording this. But for now, I just want to say thanks so much for being on this episode of Ancient Mysteries on Earth. And for all you beautiful folks watching, much love to you all. And we'll catch you in the next episode of Ancient Mysteries on Earth. Until next time.